The woman at the door was barefoot. Her feet were dusty from the gravel driveway, etched with fine lines of dirt that spoke of a long journey on foot. She held no bag, wore a faded dress, and offered no resume. She was the only person who had answered the advertisement to care for a dying little girl. And the desperate millionaire father, standing in the doorway of his sterile mansion, had 30 seconds to decide if this stranger from the countryside was the miracle he prayed for or the disaster he could not afford. The child was Ilara Vance, 6 years old, fighting a rare neurological disease that had bankrupted modern medicine. Her father, Alexander Vance, was a tech titan who could buy anything except a cure. He had fired 7 trained nurses. The woman who arrived, named Me, carried no medical bag, only a woven basket of herbs and a stillness that filled the silent house. This is the story of what happened when science surrendered, and faith, in its most unexpected form, walked through the door barefoot. But the real mystery was not her arrival. It was why she seemed to recognize the child's pain as if it were her own. Alexander Vance built his fortune on logic, algorithms, data streams, and cold, hard code. His home was a testament to this belief, a $20 million smart house where lights anticipated needs, climate control adjusted to biometrics, and a dedicated, soundproofed wing housed Ilara's medical suite. It contained $300,000 worth of monitoring equipment, a ventilator, and a specialized IV pump for the experimental drug cocktail that cost $12,000 per dose. It was all pristine, sterile, and utterly useless. Ilara's condition, juvenile degenerative autonomous neuropathy, or JDAN, was a thief. It stole nerve function slowly, beginning in the extremities. The leading specialist, Dr. Anya Mehta, had given the last prognosis 3 months prior. The disease was progressing to the respiratory system. Without a miracle, Ilara had perhaps 6 months. Alexander had fired the last nurse, a highly credentialed woman from Johns Hopkins, for the crime of pity in her eyes when she looked at him. The advertisement he posted was blunt: live-in carer for terminally ill child, no professional necessary, compassion non-negotiable. It was a scream into the void. Only one reply came, from a public library computer 40 miles away in the rural county of Pine Hollow. It read simply, "I can help her. I have no papers. My name is Me." He expected a hustler or a desperate soul looking for a room. He did not expect the woman who appeared at the iron gates. She was in her late 20s, but her eyes held a stillness that seemed ageless. The faded yellow dress was clean but threadbare at the hem. The basket she carried was woven from willow, containing bundles of dried plants, a mortar and pestle, and a small, well-worn journal. She had walked the last 2 miles from the bus stop. When Alexander, his voice tight with exhaustion and suspicion, asked for her qualifications, Me had looked past him, through the grand foyer, and toward the hallway leading to Ilara's wing. Her voice was soft, but it cut the silent house. "She is in pain. The machine beeps are too fast. Can I sit with her?" Against every rational instinct, against the furious objections of his business partner and sole confidant, David, who warned him this was liability madness, Alexander led her inside. He laid down the law in the marble hallway. She would be monitored. She would follow the strict medication schedule set by Dr. Mehta. Any deviation, and she would be removed by security immediately. Me listened, her gaze drifting to a framed, abstract painting on the wall, a chaotic splash of dark blues and grays. "This room holds too much storm," she said, more to herself than to him. Then she asked for boiled water and a clean cloth. The first shift was a silent vigil. Me did not touch the machines. She pulled a wooden chair close to Ilara's bed, placed her basket on the floor, and simply sat. She watched the child's shallow breathing, her eyes missing nothing. After an hour, she dipped the cloth in the cooled, sterilized water and began to wipe Ilara's forehead, then her small hands, with a rhythmic, gentle motion. She hummed a tune that had no name. Alexander watched from the doorway feed on his phone, his heart a knot of skepticism and fragile hope. At the scheduled time, Me administered the precise dose of medication through the IV port with a steady, careful hand. She followed the protocol to the letter, and then she did something not in the protocol. From her basket, she took a pinch of dried lavender and chamomile, placed it in a small ceramic bowl, and poured hot water over it. She didn't give it to Ilara to drink. She simply placed the steaming bowl on the bedside table, letting the gentle scent permeate the antiseptic air. Within 20 minutes, the jagged line on the heart monitor, which typically danced with erratic spikes, began to smooth. Ilara's breathing deepened. For the first time in weeks, she fell into a sleep that was not drugged, but natural. Alexander dismissed it as a coincidence, a child exhausted. But the next day it happened again. Me arrived, performed the medical tasks with quiet efficiency, and then introduced her own rituals. She opened the curtains to let in the morning sun, massaged Ilara's atrophying feet with a mild oil she had infused with rosemary, and told stories, not from books, but about the woods, about stubborn flowers that grew through cracks in stone, about a creek that sang over rocks. Ilara, who had not spoken a full sentence in a month, whispered, "Cold." She meant the creek water. Me smiled. "Yes, little one, brisk and clear." By the end of the first week, a fragile routine was born. Dr. Mehta, during her weekly visit, was astonished. Ilara's vital signs showed a slight but undeniable improvement in stability. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," she told me, who merely nodded. David, however, was deeply suspicious. He ran a background check that came back virtually empty. No social security number, no driver's license, no digital footprint beyond the library email. "She's a ghost, Alex." "Or a con artist playing a long game," he argued over whiskey in the study. "She's making her move. It's always about money." Alexander's doubts were a roaring tide, but they crashed against the simple, undeniable fact: Ilara was calmer. The pain episodes, which required emergency morphine, had decreased by 40%. The tension crested on the 10th day. Me asked to take Ilara into the walled garden. Alexander refused. It was a security risk, a temperature risk, an impossible risk. Me looked at him, her calm unwavering. "She needs to feel the earth, to remember she is part of the world, not separate from it. The medicine fights the sickness in her body. The sun must fight the sickness in her spirit." It was unscientific, almost absurd. Yet that afternoon, with a nurse on standby and Alexander watching like a hawk, Me carried Ilara, bundled in blankets, to a soft patch of grass. She sat, barefoot, and placed Ilara's pale, socked feet against her own. She said nothing. They just sat, faces tilted to the weak autumn sun. A single tear traced a path through the dust on Me's cheek. And Ilara, for the first time since her diagnosis, laughed. A soft, breathy sound that shattered Alexander's carefully constructed world of control. That night, desperate for answers, he did what he should have done first. He searched Pine Hollow, property records, old news archives. In a digitized microfilm of the county newspaper from 24 years ago, he found a brief, tragic notice. A house fire on Old Mill Road. A young couple killed. Their infant daughter, severely injured, survived. She was treated for extensive burns and nerve damage before being placed in the state system. The infant's name was not published. But the address of the fire was a vacant plot now, next to a wild, overgrown herb garden the locals said was tended by a woman who lived off the grid. The medical description of the infant's injuries, burns leading to peripheral nerve damage and chronic pain, mirrored the early, preterminal symptoms of Jadan with an eerie, impossible precision. Alexander sat back in his leather chair, the blue light of his screen the only illumination. Me was not just a stranger from the countryside. She was a woman who had survived a fire that destroyed her own nervous system. She had walked through his door not with qualifications, but with a lived, bodily understanding of his daughter's pain. She had recognized it because she had lived it. This was the connection, the profound empathy that defied all explanation. But as he stared at the date of the fire, a new, chilling realization dawned. The fire occurred exactly 24 years ago to the day, the very day Me had first appeared at his gate. This was not a coincidence. It was a pattern, and it meant Me's arrival was not an answer to his advertisement. It was the anniversary of her own tragedy. She had come for a reason he still could not see. And the question now was not whether she could help his daughter, but what haunting debt from a fire 2 decades past she was hoping to settle in this mansion's sterile, silent halls. He did not confront her the next morning. Alexander Vance, master of hostile takeovers and boardroom warfare, found himself paralyzed by a new emotion, fear of shattering the fragile peace that had settled over his home. For 3 more days he watched. He saw me brew a tea from white willow bark and ginger, which she sipped herself before offering a teaspoon to Ilara. The child's pain scores, logged by the nursing software, dropped to their lowest levels in a year. He saw me take a spool of ordinary cotton thread from her basket and with Ilara's weak fingers getting hers, begin to weave a simple, lumpy braid. "It's a cord," Ilara whispered, her voice like dry leaves, "to tie the hurting down." Alexander felt the chill of the uncanny. This was not medicine, it was ritual. His business partner, David, forced the issue. He arrived unannounced with a private investigator, a burly man named Croft, who had been digging deeper into Pine Hollow. In Alexander's study, with the door closed, Croft laid out a thin file. The fire was ruled an accident, faulty wiring. The infant survivor was placed in foster care. Records are sealed, but I tracked the caseworker. The child was adopted 2 years later by a family named Miller. They moved out of state. Slid a grainy photocopy of an old school photo across the desk. A girl of about 8 with dark, serious eyes. The name scrawled on the back read, "Me Miller." She disappears from official records at age 16. No high school graduation, no employment history. The Millers are deceased. The trail goes cold. David pounced. "So she's a runaway, a drifter, and now she's in your house with your daughter." But Croft wasn't finished. He placed a second document next to the photo, a property deed. The land where the fire occurred, the overgrown herb garden, was purchased 5 years ago by a holding company. Alexander recognized the corporate signature immediately. It was a subsidiary of his own venture capital firm, Vance Holdings. He had approved the portfolio acquisition without a second thought. The vacant lot was slated for a stalled eco-housing project. He was, technically, Me's landlord. The revelation was a gut punch. Her arrival wasn't just about the anniversary. It was about him. She had come to the owner of the land where her life burned down. The coincidence was too precise, too orchestrated. David argued for immediate removal and a restraining order. "She's a liability and a potential extremist, Alex. She connects you to that fire. What if she blames your company? What if this is some long-con revenge?" That evening, as Me sang a low, wordless lullaby to Ilara, Alexander finally approached her in the kitchen. He held up the school photo. "This is you." Me stopped wiping a dish. She looked at the picture for a long time, her expression unreadable. "A long time ago," she said softly. "Why are you here, Me? Really?" She set the cloth down and met his gaze. Her eyes, usually a placid gray, held a storm. "Because she called for me." "Ilara, she didn't know you existed." "Not with her voice," Me said. She touched her own chest over her heart. "With the breaking, I know the sound, it echoes. I heard it in the earth on that land, I followed it here." It was an answer that explained nothing and everything. It was mysticism, madness, or a truth so profound it defied language. Alexander the logician had no framework for it. He issued an ultimatum instead. "You will submit to a full psychological evaluation. You will allow Croft to interview you. If you refuse, you leave tonight." Me agreed, but the evaluation, conducted by a psychiatrist David recommended, backfired spectacularly. Dr. Evans spent 2 hours with me and emerged visibly unsettled. His report stated she presented with no signs of psychosis, delusion, or cognitive impairment. Her affect was appropriate, her memory sharp. When asked about the fire, she spoke of heat and light and a voice singing her to sleep. She displayed an exceptional somatic awareness, an ability to perceive and describe physical sensations in others with alarming accuracy, which she attributed to listening to the silence in the body. Dr. Evans's concluding note read, "Subject possesses either a highly refined, unstudied form of empathic intuition or is simulating sanity with unprecedented skill. Clinical tools are insufficient." Croft's interview yielded even less. Me answered questions about her past with vague references to the woods and the garden. She offered no timeline, no names. She was, as Croft said, a locked box with no key. The standoff was broken by catastrophe. Ilara's condition had been stable, but stability in Jaydan is a temporary illusion. A sudden autonomic storm hit. A violent system-wide rebellion that spiked her heart rate to 180, sent her temperature soaring, and triggered seizures. Alarms shrieked through the medical wing. The on-call nurse scrambled to administer emergency drugs. Dr. Mehta, on the video call, ordered immediate preparation for hospitalization. Ventilator was being wheeled in when Me, who had been barred from the room during the crisis, pushed past a protesting Alexander. She went straight to the bed, placed her hands on Ilara's heaving chest and sweat-drenched forehead and closed her eyes. She began to hum the same nameless tune, but lower, stronger, a vibration you could feel in your bones. She whispered words that weren't English. The nurse tried to pull her away. "She's interfering," but Alexander, watching the monitor, saw it. Jagged, frantic lines began to slow. The heart rate plummeted from 180 to 140, then 120. The seizures subsided into tremors, then stillness. Ilara's body went limp, not in unconsciousness, but in exhausted relief. The storm had passed in 90 seconds. Me opened her eyes, her own face pale with effort. She looked at Alexander and said, "The medicine fights the fire in her nerves, but the storm is in her spirit. You cannot tube a spirit." In that moment, Alexander's worldview fractured. Logic had failed, protocol had failed. This woman, with her bare feet and her basket of weeds, had succeeded. He fired the on-call nurse on the spot. He told Dr. Mater to stand down. From that day, me was given full, unchallenged authority over Ilara's daily care. The medical equipment remained, but it became background. The center of the room became the chair where me sat, the basket at her feet, the braid of thread growing longer in Ilara's small hands. David resigned from the board in protest, warning of catastrophic legal and reputational fallout. The story inevitably leaked. A tech blog ran a piece titled "Vance's Voodoo, Billionaire Ditches Doctors for Mystic." It was picked up by gossip columns, then by mainstream news. Alexander was painted as a grief-crazed eccentric, me as a predatory charlatan. Child Protective Services opened an investigation. A social worker named Gina Cortez arrived, clipboard in hand, skepticism in her eyes. She toured the medical wing, interviewed Alexander, and then asked to speak with Ilara alone. With me present, Ilara, who now could speak in short sentences, told the social worker about the garden, the tea, the braid. When asked if she was afraid of me, Ilara shook her head. "She holds the quiet for me." Gina then asked me the standard questions about discipline, education, and safety. Me's answers were simple, direct, and centered entirely on Ilara's comfort. As the interview concluded, Gina's eyes fell on Me's bare feet. She noted the clean, calloused soles, the dust from the garden path. A flicker of something, not judgment, but recognition, passed over her face. She was from a rural community herself. As she left, she said to Alexander, "The state mandates certain standards, Mr. Vance. But my report will note the child appears bonded, calm, and is not in immediate physical danger. The medical neglect allegation, however, remains. You will be required to have a licensed RN on premises at all times as a condition of her remaining." It was a compromise, but a new cage. Alexander hired a nurse, a stern woman named Brenda, who viewed me with open contempt and reported every deviation from the medical plan to Dr. Mater. The house became a battlefield of silent glares and procedural sabotage. Brenda would adjust IV rates after me left the room, citing orders. She would throw away the herb bowls, calling them biohazards. The tension coiled tighter every day, and through it all, me worked. She taught Ilara to breathe in patterns, to visualize cool water running down her spine. The child's color improved. She gained 2 pounds. She asked for storybooks again. The breaking point came from an unexpected direction. Alexander, trying to mend fences with his board, attended a gala. There he was cornered by a rival CEO, a man named Sterling, who had been buying up shares of Vance Holdings. Sterling, smirking over champagne, said, "Sorry to hear about your daughter. And the caregiver situation. Nasty business, the media, bad for stock value, makes a company look unstable, makes it ripe for a change in leadership." The threat was clear. Alexander's personal crisis was being weaponized for a corporate coup. He returned home to find Brenda in a fury. Me had taken Ilara outside during a light rain against explicit orders. "She'll catch pneumonia," Brenda yelled. Alexander found them in the garden under the covered pergola. Ilara was wrapped in a blanket, her hand outstretched, catching droplets. She was smiling. Me looked at Alexander, and for the first time he saw a crack in her calm. It was fear. Not for herself, but for the child. "They are coming for her," Me said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "The men in suits who see only numbers. They will take her from you, and then they will take her from me, and she will break." She was talking about more than CPS or the board. She was talking about the system, the machine of medicine and law that was closing in. That night, Alexander accessed the full, unredacted fire marshal's report from 24 years ago. Buried in the appendix was an interview with a first responder. The infant hadn't been found in the nursery. She'd been found in the root cellar, wrapped in a wet wool blanket, placed there before the flames reached the kitchen. The person who saved her had to have been inside the house. The report noted the parents' bodies were found near the front door. They hadn't made it to the cellar. Someone else had. The question of who saved baby Me was officially unsolved. But a local rumor, noted in the margin by the investigator, suggested a transient herbalist, a woman who sometimes worked on the property, had been seen fleeing the scene that night. She was never identified. She was known only as the Root Woman. Alexander looked from the report to the live feed of Ilara's room. Me was placing a cool compress on the child's forehead. A Root Woman, a woman who knew cellars and herbs in the quiet of the earth, a woman who saved children from fire. The pieces were forming a picture, but it was a picture from a fairy tale, not a forensic report. He called Croft. "I need you to find out everything about that herbalist, every rumor, every fragment." Croft's reply was grim. "I already did. There's no paper trail, but there's a newer rumor. In Pine Hollow, they say the Root Woman's knowledge doesn't die. It's passed down, mother to daughter, or to girl she saves." The line went silent as the implication hung in the air. Me wasn't just a survivor of the fire. She might have been the Root Woman's legacy. She wasn't settling a debt from the past. She was fulfilling a calling. And that calling had now drawn the attention of forces far more dangerous than a skeptical board. A pharmaceutical company that had been developing a proprietary billion-dollar drug for Jadan's symptoms. A drug whose trial data was being undermined by the simple, unpatentable fact that a barefoot woman with herbs was achieving better results. The company was called Neurovance Pharma. It was a subsidiary Alexander had spun off years earlier to develop neurological treatments. Its flagship drug, NV11, was in phase 3 trials for Jadan's symptom management. The preliminary data was mediocre, moderate pain reduction with severe gastrointestinal side effects. But the projected market was $2.3 billion annually. The CEO, a former colleague of Alexander's named Robert Hull, called him personally. The tone was friendly, corporate. "Alex, we're hearing incredible anecdotes about your daughter. Off the record, if this caregiver has a methodology, even a holistic one, we'd be very interested in a consultation. We could structure a generous licensing agreement. It would legitimize her work, protect you both." Alexander saw the trap immediately. To study Me's methods was to dissect them, own them, and ultimately bury them if they couldn't be patented. He refused. The friendly tone vanished. "Then you leave me no choice but to protect our trial integrity. Unverified interventions compromise patient safety and regulatory approval. We have a duty to report." The report came in the form of a detailed, anonymous complaint to the Medical Board and Child Protective Services, alleging gross medical neglect and the endangerment of a vulnerable minor by an unlicensed practitioner. It was accompanied by sworn statements from 2 of Ilara's former nurses and Brenda, the current RN, who claimed Me had interfered with life-saving medication and promoted magical thinking over science. The CPS case, which had been dormant, was suddenly turbocharged. A new caseworker, an older man named Carl Riggs with a reputation for being by the book, arrived with a court-appointed pediatrician. They demanded a full medical evaluation of Ilara in a hospital setting, away from Me's influence. Alexander's lawyers fought for an in-home evaluation. The judge, swayed by the pharmaceutical company's expert affidavit, ordered the hospital assessment. It was a tactical loss. Ilara would be taken from the house. The night before the scheduled removal, Me did not sleep. She sat in the garden until dawn. When Alexander found her, her feet were bare in the dew-soaked grass, her hands clenched around her woven basket. "They will take her into a white room," she said, her voice hollow. "The machines will be loud, the lights will be bright, she will be afraid. And when she is afraid, the pain comes like a wave. They will not know how to hold the quiet for her." Alexander, feeling the walls of the world closing in, made a desperate decision. He called Robert Hull. "Call off the dogs, what do you want?" Hull's price was absolute. Exclusive rights to any and all methodologies used by Me, presented in a formal, replicable format, plus a non-disclosure agreement and a non-compete clause that would effectively silence Me forever. Alexander hung up. He couldn't sell her. He told me they had to document what she did. Everything. Every herb, every touch, every word. If they could present it as a structured complementary care plan, they might satisfy the court. Me looked at him with a sadness so deep it seemed to swallow the light. You cannot put the song of the creek in a manual. You cannot write down the way the quiet feels. The next morning, they left for the hospital. Ilara, sensing the tension, was silent and withdrawn. The evaluation at Savannah General was a 7-hour ordeal of blood draws, scans, and neurological tests conducted by a team who treated Me like a contaminant. She was barred from the examination room. Alexander watched through a window as Ilara, in a sterile gown, began to tremble. Her heart rate climbed on the monitor. A nurse tried to calm her with a tablet showing cartoons. Ilara turned her face to the wall. Then she did something she hadn't done since me arrived. She began to cry, a soundless, shaking weep that spoke of utter terror. The lead neurologist, Dr. Evans, noted psychosomatic escalation likely due to condition dependency on the unlicensed caregiver. The report, when issued, was damning. It stated that while Ilara's vitals were stable, her psychological state was fragile and her pain management was non-standard and potentially harmful. The recommendation was immediate removal to a dedicated pediatric palliative care facility for deprogramming and science-based treatment. Carl Riggs had the court order in hand. By 5 p.m. Ilara was not going home. Alexander's legal team filed an emergency appeal. It would take 3 days. For those 3 days, Ilara would remain at Savannah General in a secured wing. Me was granted one supervised, 1-hour visit per day. The first visit, Alexander watched from the hallway. Me entered the room, ignored the supervising nurse, and went straight to the bed. She didn't touch the machines. She placed her basket on the floor, took Ilara's hand, and began to hum. Within 10 minutes, the child's rigid body relaxed. She fell into a deep, natural sleep. The nurse wrote in her log, "Child sedated by caregiver's actions, method unclear." It was not sedation. It was sanctuary, but it was only an hour. During the second visit, something shifted. Me, as she was leaving, placed her hand on the window ledge and looked out at the parking lot. Her expression changed. She turned to Alexander, her eyes wide. "The man from the company, he is here." Alexander looked. Robert Hull was indeed walking into the hospital, accompanied by 2 men in suits. They weren't heading to administration. They were heading to the pediatric wing. Alexander intercepted them. Hull was all smiles. "Terrible business, Alex. I came to offer my support to the clinical team and to offer once more a way out. Let us work with your Ms. Me. We can have her certified as a therapeutic aid." The court would drop the order in a heartbeat. It was extortion dressed as charity. Alexander refused again. Hull's smile didn't waver. A pity. After he left, Alexander had Croft dig deeper. What he found was a connection that turned the blood in his veins to ice. The judge who signed the removal order, Judge Morrow, sat on the board of a charitable foundation that was the largest donor to the hospital's new pediatric wing. The foundation's chairman was Robert Hull's brother-in-law. The system wasn't just leaning against them. It was a closed loop, engineered to extract what it wanted. That night, broken and out of options, Alexander did the only thing he had left. He went to Me's temporary quarters, a small room over the garage. He found her writing in her journal by candlelight. "I need to understand," he said, his voice raw. "The root woman, the fire, tell me everything. It's the only currency I have left to trade." Me closed her book. For a long moment she was silent. Then she began to speak. The story she told was not what he expected. The root woman wasn't a mystic. She was a researcher. Her name was Elena Vance. Alexander staggered back as if struck. Vance, his own grandmother, a botanist and ethnopharmacologist from a wealthy family who had been written out of the family history for her eccentricities. She had owned the land in Pine Hollow as a private research station. The fire wasn't an accident. It was arson, set by a business rival of his grandfather's during a bitter dispute over land rights. Elena Vance had died in that fire. But not before saving the infant, the child of her 2 assistants, by carrying her to the root cellar. The infant was Me's mother. Elena Vance had saved her, and then in the foster system, that child had been adopted by the Millers. But the knowledge, the legacy of herbs and somatic care, had been passed down through handwritten journals that Me's mother had preserved and on her deathbed entrusted to Me. Me had not come to Alexander's house by chance. She had come because she was the living legacy of his own disinherited grandmother. She had come because the child of the woman who saved her was now dying of a neurological disease, and the only person who might have known how to treat it was the grandmother they shared. She had come to repay a life debt to the Vance line, using the very knowledge that line had tried to erase. The revelation recontextualized everything. Me wasn't a stranger. She was family. Her methods weren't folk magic. They were the lost, non-patentable, holistic neuroscience of Elena Vance, suppressed by a family that chose pharmaceutical profits over plant-based wisdom. Alexander was not harboring a charlatan. He was hosting the heiress to a stolen legacy. and the company now trying to crush them was built on the fortune that had turned its back on that legacy. The next morning, armed with this truth, Alexander's lawyers went back to court with a new filing, a motion to dismiss based on conflict of interest and family kinship, asserting Me's rightful place as a caregiver within the family unit. It was a legal Hail Mary. The hearing was set for the following day, but as Alexander left the courthouse, his phone rang. It was the head nurse on Ilara's floor. Ilara had spiked a fever of 104 degrees. She was unresponsive. They believed it was sepsis, likely from a compromised IV line. They were moving her to the intensive care unit. They did not expect her to survive the night. The race was no longer about custody. It was about life and death. And the only person who had ever been able to calm the storms in Ilara's body was barred from her bedside by a hospital administrator following the risk management protocol sparked by Robert Hull's complaint. Alexander Vance stood on the courthouse steps, the city swirling around him, realizing he had won the truth but was about to lose his daughter. And in that moment, he understood that the final battle would not be fought in a boardroom or a courtroom. It would be fought in the sterile, buzzing silence of an ICU, where the world of science was about to declare defeat, and the only thing left to deploy was a faith he still didn't understand, carried in the heart of a barefoot woman waiting in a room over a garage. Alexander did not go to the ICU. He turned his back on the hospital and drove 90 miles an hour through the city, back to the house over the garage. He found me standing in the middle of her room, her journal open to a page filled with precise drawings of nerves and roots. She was waiting. "They won't let you in," he said, breathless. "I know," she replied. "Then we are going to break the rules," he stated. He didn't mean a legal argument. He meant the physical ones. He called his security team, 2 former Special Forces operatives who were loyal to him, not the company. He gave them one instruction: create a diversion at the main entrance of Savannah General in 15 minutes. Then he and me got back into the car. At the hospital, chaos was unfolding. A reported gas leak near the main lobby triggered an evacuation protocol for the ground floor. Security and staff were diverted. Alexander, using his knowledge of the building's blueprints from the donation, led me through a service entrance and up a freight elevator to the 3rd floor ICU. They emerged into a hallway that was, for the moment, deserted. Through the glass wall of room 308, they could see Ilara, tiny and still amid a nest of wires and tubes, surrounded by a team of doctors and nurses. Her skin was a terrible waxy gray. A resident was calling out numbers, blood pressure dropping. Alexander didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open. Every head turned. The attending physician, a man with a harried expression, barked, "You can't be in here." Alexander ignored him. He looked at the nurse who had called him, a woman named Sarah with kind eyes who had been sympathetic from the start. He said, "You have 3 minutes, then you can call security. Give her 3 minutes." He stepped aside, and me walked into the room. She didn't look at the doctors. She went to the side of the bed opposite the machinery. She placed her basket on the floor. She took Ilara's small, swollen hand in both of hers. She closed her eyes, and she began to hum. The sound was low, resonant, and completely out of place in the sterile chaos. The attending physician moved to stop her. "She's a sepsis risk, get her out." But Nurse Sarah put a gentle hand on his arm. "Doctor, look." On the monitor, Ilara's heart rate, which had been a racing, irregular line, began to slow. The erratic spikes smoothed. The blood pressure numbers, which had been declining, stabilized. Me opened her eyes and spoke not to the room but to Ilara. "Come back, little root. The storm is passing. The earth is holding you." She then reached into her basket and took out a small vial of dark oil. She uncorked it, and the scent of lavender, frankincense, and something earthy filled the room. She dabbed a drop on Ilara's temples and over her heart. The head of pediatric critical care, Dr. Evans, who had been summoned, watched in stunned silence. He had been the one to write the damning report. Now he saw the impossible. The fever, which had not budged with antipyretics, began to drop. 104, 103.5, 103. The numbers ticked down on the screen. The sepsis alarm stopped flashing. The room fell silent, except for the hum of machines and Me's low, steady voice. After 10 minutes, Ilara's eyelids fluttered. She didn't wake, but her breathing deepened, syncing with Me's rhythm. The crisis had passed. The medical team stood in a state of professional shock. They had thrown everything modern medicine had at the infection, and it was this, a hum, a touch, a drop of oil that had turned the tide. Dr. Evans, a man of pure science, found his voice. "What did you do?" Me looked up, her face pale with effort. I reminded her body how to fight. The medicine kills the invaders. Her spirit must do the rest. They were working against each other, now they are not. It was an explanation that made no clinical sense, and yet the evidence was on the monitors. Alexander spoke to the room. "She stays, as a family member, as a consultant, I don't care what you call it, she stays." Dr. Evans, after a long pause, nodded. He overruled the attending. "We will allow it under supervision, and we will document everything." For the next 48 hours, Me never left the room. She slept in a chair. She administered her oils and her touches alongside the IV antibiotics. She taught the nurses the humming pattern to use when she stepped out. Ilara's fever broke completely, the infection cleared, and something else happened. The autonomic storms, the hallmark of Jadan, did not return. Her nervous system, which had been in constant rebellion, found a fragile, newfound stability. Scans showed reduced inflammation in her nerve pathways. It was unprecedented. News of the miracle in the ICU spread through the hospital. It reached the media. The narrative flipped overnight. The billionaire eccentric became a determined father. The predatory charlatan became a mysterious healer. The court, inundated with new evidence from the hospital's own doctors, dissolved the removal order. The conflict of interest with Judge Morrow was exposed, and the case was reassigned. Child Protective Services closed their investigation with a recommendation for a monitored, integrated care plan. The corporate warfare ended just as swiftly. Alexander used the media storm and the hospital's data to launch a shareholder revolt against Robert Hull. He presented the evidence of Hull's manipulation of the medical and legal systems to the board. Hull was forced to resign. Neuro Vance Pharma was folded back into Vance Holdings, and its drug trial was halted. Alexander publicly pledged to fund independent research into the somatic and botanical approaches used by me, not to patent them, but to make them freely available. His stock, after an initial dip, soared. The story of redemption was better for the brand than the story of cold ambition. 3 weeks later, Ilara was discharged. She walked out of the hospital, holding both Alexander's hand and me's. She was still frail, still sick, but the terminal prognosis had been replaced with the word manageable. They returned not to the sterile mansion, but to a smaller home Alexander bought on the edge of Pine Hollow, near the overgrown herb garden. Me tended the garden, reviving her grandmother's work. Alexander learned to be still. He learned to listen. He learned to kneel in the dirt beside his daughter and plant seeds. The final surprise came not in a dramatic revelation, but in a quiet moment. Alexander was going through the last of his grandmother's effects, stored in a family vault. He found a sealed letter addressed to the keeper of the garden. Inside was a deed, not for land, but for a trust. Elena Vance had set up a perpetual fund to support the work of herbal medicine, hidden from the family that disowned her. The sole trustee was to be a direct female descendant of her assistant, the woman who died in the fire. That descendant was me. The trust, with compound interest over 24 years, was worth just over $4 million. Me had never been poor. She had been rich in a currency she didn't know how to access, waiting for the right moment to claim her inheritance. When Alexander gave her the letter, she cried, not for the money, but for the acknowledgement. Her grandmother, by spirit if not by blood, had seen her coming. 1 year later, the garden is thriving. Ilara attends a local school part-time, her condition managed by a blend of targeted medication and daily sessions with me. Alexander stepped down as CEO, remaining as chairman to oversee the philanthropic wing. And me, she published her grandmother's journals and her own as an open-source compendium. She teaches workshops at the hospital. She still goes barefoot when the earth is warm. The three of them are a family, bound not by blood, but by a choice made in a moment of absolute desperation, and a truth that was waiting in the roots. The lesson was not that science failed or that magic prevailed. It was that healing, true healing, requires both the mind and the heart. It requires the courage to listen to the quiet and the strength to stand barefoot in the storm. Alexander Vance learned that the greatest fortune is not what you build, but what you choose to hold on to when everything else is falling apart. And sometimes, the person sent to save you doesn't arrive with a resume, but with a basket of herbs a song on her lips, and the dust of the road on her feet. So what do we call what happened in that house? A miracle suggests a divine hand interrupting the laws of nature. A medical anomaly implies a statistical fluke, a data point to be filed away. But perhaps it was something else entirely, a reminder that the map is not the territory. We build systems of incredible sophistication to understand the human body, dazzling networks of logic and light. But in our reverence for the map, we sometimes forget to feel the earth beneath our feet. We dismiss the quiet language of touch, the wisdom written in plants, the power of a presence that says, "I will hold the silence for you." Alexander Vance had a map of everything: his empire, his daughter's disease, his planned future. It was me, arriving with empty hands and full heart, who reminded him that the territory of healing is a living, breathing thing, often found in the spaces between the data points. This story forces a difficult, beautiful question. When faced with an impossible situation, where do we place our faith? In the institution, the protocol, the peer-reviewed study, or in the stranger, the intuition, the unprovable feeling? The answer, as this family discovered, isn't an either-or. It's a bridge. The antibiotics fought the infection. Me's presence fought the terror that made the infection lethal. The modern world and the ancient one are not at war. They are two halves of a conversation we stopped listening to. We privileged one voice and called the other superstition. But what if it's just a different dialect of care? Ilara's story isn't about rejecting science. It's about expanding our definition of it. True science is curiosity. It is observation without prejudice. When doctors in That ICU watched a fever break not from a new drug, but from a hum and a drop of oil, they were witnessing a phenomenon their textbooks couldn't explain. The courageous response isn't to dismiss it, but to wonder. What symphony of scent, sound, and somatic connection triggered a parasympathetic response strong enough to tip the scale? That question is now the basis of a new research initiative, one that doesn't seek to own, but to understand. For every one of us, the metaphor holds. We all build fortresses of certainty in our careers, our relationships, our self-image. We believe the walls will keep out the chaos. But sometimes, the very thing that saves us doesn't come knocking at the gate. It doesn't have the right credentials. It appears, barefoot and unexpected, in our moment of deepest despair. The test is whether we are too busy defending our fortress to see the offering in its hands. The offering might be forgiveness, where we expect blame. It might be simplicity, where we are lost in complexity. It might be a person we have been taught to overlook. Alexander Vance's wealth couldn't buy a cure. What it bought in the end was the humility to accept a gift that had no price tag. His journey from skepticism to surrender is the oldest human story there is. It's the story of learning that control is an illusion, and that strength is found not in holding on tighter, but in knowing when to let go and take the hand that's reaching for you in the dark. So look around your own life. Where are you clinging to the map, while the territory whispers a different truth? What quiet wisdom have you dismissed because it didn't arrive in the proper package? The next time you face your own impossible situation, remember the barefoot woman and the dying child. Remember that miracles are not violations of nature. They are often just nature itself, heard clearly for the first time in a moment of perfect, desperate quiet. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the unseen connections that hold our world together, then share it. Pass it on to someone who might need to hear that hope often wears a disguise. And if you want to join us for more journeys into the heart of what truly matters, into the stories that challenge what we think we know, then subscribe. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is simply the courage to open a door.